Welcome to the History Bards Historical Movie Reviews. It's movie time starting in 4, 3, 2, 1. With your hosts, Michael Zucker and Dee Marley. Today's movie review, The Great Gatsby, directed by Baz Luhrmann.
Hey everyone, this is Dee Marley and Michael Zucker, and welcome to the History Bards podcast. Today's movie review is The Great Gatsby, directed by Baz Luhrmann and starring Leonardo DiCaprio, as well as the older version starring Robert Redford. And we're going to compare the film to the book written by F. Scott Fitzgerald. So everybody knows that this book is a classic novel. It stood the test of time. It has captivated readers. It's got incredible prose and characters, beautifully descriptive prose, in my opinion. It's like one of my favorite books of all time. And to me, I really feel very strongly about the second movie versus the first movie. But I'm sure, Michael, you have thoughts on that too. How do you feel about The Great Gatsby?
So to me, I think the prose, I think this novel has, a number of very strong features, but the prose might be its strongest, the one that sort of puts it over the top as arguably the most highly acclaimed American novel of the 20th century.
Yeah.
That in 1998, I think, the publishing house Random House did a panel that kind of picked the 100 greatest English language novels of the 20th century.
Yes.
And The Great Gatsby got number 2 next to Ulysses by James Joyce. And I think that just kind of shows the level of respect and acclaim that this novel received. And part of what's interesting is that Fitzgerald's other novels and short stories, I feel like, are not held, almost even close to the same level of regard as The Great Gatsby is, whereas somebody like, Ernest Hemingway has none of Hemingway's novels are quite as highly regarded as The Great Gatsby, but a larger portion of his catalog of work is held in high regard.
Yeah, I agree with that. I absolutely agree. I think that with Fitzgerald's book, it's just, there are so many, sometimes you can just pick out a few lines, maybe one line that you really like out of it, but there are so many. There's just so many little jewels throughout this entire novel. And that's what I really love. I love to be able to take a historical novel and sit there and be able to highlight and then go back and look, kind of flip through it and see how many highlights I've done. That really tells a lot about a novel to me. And this one has just tons of highlights. And I couldn't, because I took a moment to sit down and say, okay, what are my favorite lines from the movie? What are my favorite lines? Did they include them in the movie versus the book? And I was, truly impressed by how they stood out more, because I think we both kind of agree the first movie with Robert Redford, it just lacks a little something.
Right. I think it's lacking a certain energy, and I think in my view, I think both films have similar issues in adapting the novel, part of which is, again, that if the prose is the standout function, obviously a film cannot, adapt the prose in the way that it can the dialogue. And so a film version is just inherently going to lack that element, at least in its entirety. So I think one of the best lines within the novel is when Nick is meeting Gatsby for the first time, and it's describing his smile.
Yeah.
And the film, I guess you could have a sort of narration or something over it, but you can't sort of just duplicate it in the same way that you could with some of the dialogue.
You're talking about the first film though, right? Because the second one, he did it because to me it almost because he was narrating, because in Nick Carraway was telling his doctor, it was pretty much a narration. But that scene whenever he whenever he turns around with his glass of champagne and says, "I'm Jay Gatsby," that smile, I think Leonardo DiCaprio just it was spot on, like exactly what Nick was describing. That smile, there was something in that smile that just made you feel like, um, how the quote goes in the book. And that's kind of one of the things I was saying about how, to me, the second movie, because every once in a while you'll hear a line from the book, and it just, the way Baz Luhrmann was able to capture that moment, that quote, that famous quote from the book, like when she says that she hoped her little girl was a beautiful little fool.
Right.
That, I don't know, it was just like perfectly done. That, to me, that was like encapsulated what Fitzgerald was trying to say or portray in the book. I don't know. And again, to me, the second movie is by far my favorite one of the two.
Yeah, I would put them on a fairly similar level, I think. To me, they almost have like opposite problems in that the first one from the 1970s is sort of lacking a level of energy. And the second one I would almost describe as having too much in a way. It's that it almost is less representative of the 1920s, and obviously The Great Gatsby in a lot of ways defines America's memory of the 1920s. But the second one to me feels almost more akin to like the summer of love in 1967, if that makes sense, as though like the Beatles had made Sgt. Pepper, and before making Magical Mystery Tour, they just decided to make The Great Gatsby for some reason. That like just the level of energy and color and just noise being thrown in your face is more reminiscent of that era.
I mean, I get what you're saying. I think I'll have to like I mean, I understand what you're saying. But I think in relation to that time period and what everyone was going through as far as after the Great War, and it just felt like an explosion of energy and freedom, and clothing changed, attitudes changed, the war was over, let's have a lot of liquor and party and lots of jazz. And I kind of relate it to seeing other films like Chicago, or seeing there was another one that I was thinking of, um and it just slipped my mind. So, but anyway, you think about that era of jazz and liquor, because that line from Chicago always stands out to me. And the speakeasies, when everybody had to, go down, knock on doors to get in to get liquor. And it just, the amount of criminal activity because of that, and the I don't know, it just felt very authentic to me. And I don't know why it did, because maybe it wasn't like that, but I just felt like, from the standpoint of this explosion of everybody was like freed from a lot of restraints of Victorian ideals, because before the war there was so much of that Victorian ideal. You can't, the way they dressed, the way they thought, and then the war just like took all of that away. And you know so I just felt like that, and maybe a few things were over the top, maybe I don't know, but I did feel like that the whole idea of jazz and liquor and partying, and the wealth, the amount of wealth that they were, because actually one of the things that I can remember about reading The Great Gatsby and seeing these movies is how much this portrayed the American dream, because there's so many like there's so much symbolism in that movie about reaching for, that we know that Jay Gatsby does that. He's constantly reaching for, like the grass is always greener, or reaching for the stars. so it was like that time period as well, and the wealth that was being spent. So, and then you had like the different scenarios of the wealth that Jay Gatsby had and the wealth that the Buchanans had, that, and then like right in the middle, you had like the common people who were in, the Valley of Ashes, that they would have to drive through to the city. So it was like this whole combination. I just think, I don't know, the cinematography, the symbolism that he was able to portray in it, I just think it was incredibly well thought out. And I have to say, my mother has always told me that my grandmother could dance the Charleston like nobody's business, and I wish that I could have seen that. But I can just imagine her dancing like at one of those parties. It just seemed very, very real to me.
I mean, I think, we can have a deeper discussion of this, that like the 1920s and 60s, which we brought up,
Yeah,
resemble each other in a number of ways, that
yeah,
both are sort of eras of large generational rebellion against the status quo.
yeah,
The 1920s being sort of the country sort of, reacting against World War One. I mean, there's a lot of discussion of the lost generation. I
right.
think you mentioned Hemingway already, that The Sun Also Rises
Mm-hmm.
gives sort of a different, although probably comparable analysis of that era
Yeah,
to The Great Gatsby. The 60s, both rebelling against some of the conformity of the 50s, but also reacting against the escalation of the Vietnam War.
yeah,
Fitzgerald brought up sort of the major themes of both the novel and the films. I think Fitzgerald is pretty clearly critiquing what we now call the American dream.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, that's for sure.
Both, the sort of established money of the Buchanans sort of not accepting Gatsby into their sphere, even though he's sort of much more recently built up his wealth. But also, and I'm interested in your thoughts on this. Is Fitzgerald saying that somebody like Gatsby, who was born poor and is trying to become wealthier, could he only obtain wealth through crime, essentially, as a bootlegger?
In that time period, I think it was just it was so easy. I just think it was an easy way, and he had to do it. He was trying to do it quickly. We know that because of his goal. His goal was Daisy, so he had to find a way to do it quickly and to create this whole entire persona. You know, um, so I just feel like that because of the what was going on in that time period with the prohibition and the corruption within the police departments and government, it was just easy.
Well, it was easy, but is Fitzgerald saying that being a bootlegger, or essentially a criminal, is the only real way to sort of, quote, achieve the American dream? And other than that, it's just sort of a myth perpetuated by the super wealthy to justify their power.
No, I don't. I mean, I don't really get that. I don't think that he was saying that that's the only way to.
Okay, so
Yeah.
so then the critique is more just the Buchanans, like whether it was legitimate or not, in terms of how Gatsby achieved his wealth. The Buchanans were just never going to accept someone like him into their sphere.
No. Yeah, I don't think it mattered. I think it mattered very little to somebody like Tom Buchanan, what anybody else did. You know, if they weren't in that, in his perceived idea of wealth, and I think that's the reason why Fitzgerald used that about West Egg and East Egg, and that there was such a great divide, that he was never going to cross over from where he was. And I think that was another symbolic image that he used. And, honestly, that's been, throughout history. there's a lot of old money that, you know, used to feel that way. Even during the Victorian times, they would feel that way. And so, I mean, I think that's basically what he was trying to portray there about the division of wealth. And even if you did make a whole lot of money, that you could still not cross over.
That seemed to me almost like less of a critique of sort of modern capitalism then, and then more of
Yeah.
almost just an accusation of aristocracy
Yeah.
within American society, especially on the East Coast.
Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely feel that way too. So I kind of wanted to, like, you know, we were talking a little bit earlier about some of the great lines in this book and film and everything. So tell me what some of your favorite ones are.
Well, one thing that I noticed is that the more modern version closes with sort of the famous final lines of
Yeah.
I'm trying to do it off the top of my head. So we beat on boats against the current, borne back
Yeah.
ceaselessly into the past,
Yeah.
which sort of captures Gatsby's entire character arc. I think both have one of my other favorite lines of exchange of dialogue where Gatsby's talking about Daisy and Nick says, you know, you can't repeat the past, Jay. And
Yeah.
Gatsby says, you know, he just kind of looks confused for a second. He's like, can't repeat the past. Of course you can.
Of course you can. Yeah.
But then both of them have that line, but the one from the 1970s does not close with sort of the famous final lines, which I thought was interesting that they sort of just did not make an effort to include that, when it's a lot of people think it might be this, you know, the single greatest final line within an English language novel.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that. And isn't that odd that they didn't do that?
Yeah.
So what I wanted to say about, like, my favorite lines, I love the line, I like large parties, they're so intimate. You know, small parties, there isn't any privacy. I thought that was a really, really interesting line because I don't know, it made me really stop for a minute and thinking about parties that I've been to, and I'm like, wow, that's really, really interesting. I've never thought about it from that perspective. And then the line about I was within and without, simultaneously enchanted and repelled by the inexhaustible variety of life. So I think that line right there really played into the energy of the second movie, the inexhaustible variety of life. Well, like whenever he looked out the windows and he was watching through his window, that single window, I know that's another line from the book, the single window, and looking at it, all the different varieties of life, and how he felt that he was within and without, because he was taking in all of that and everything that New York was offering at that time. And plus, you know, because if you think about, and I've done this before, I know as a historical fiction author, a lot of us do this, looking at different people or cars that pass by and you're wondering, where are they going? What's their story? You know, and I think that that's what Nick was also doing, because while he was in the midst of a story, everything that was going on with Tom and Daisy and Gatsby and him in it, there were all these other little stories throughout the city that were going on at the same time. So I just thought that was a really incredible, just to encapsulate everything in just that one line was just amazing. But then I have to get into about the green light. I know you've already brought that up. And, you know, when I first saw the second movie, I didn't have the same kind of emotional reaction I did with the first one. Like you said, there wasn't very much energy in the first one, but the second movie brought such a strong emotional reaction for me about the green light from the very beginning to the very end, because you had, like you said, that whole arc of what that meant, and that image of, like, whenever he was a young boy and he kept reaching for the stars, but he could never get them. But then that part when that says that, I have it written down. Hold on, I'm gonna. Oh, whenever Nick said possibly it occurred to him that the colossal significance of that light had now vanished forever. Compared to the great distance that had separated him from Daisy, it had seemed very near to her, almost touching her. It had seemed as close as a star to the moon. Now it was again a green light on the dock. His count of enchanted objects had diminished by one. So I just, it's almost like that's what he kept, he would go to the end of his dock and reach for it. But then once it came to fruition, did it have the same kind of, enchantment that he thought it did? And obviously not, because she was she was not a nice person.
Well, I think Fitzgerald built, this entire sort of thematic, structure that we've discussed into, a literary tragedy that, that Daisy represents sort of obtaining, wealth and status within the United States, for Gatsby, and his obsession to do that leads to his destruction.
Yeah.
So one thing that I'm interested in asking is, what do you think of sort of the different levels of characterization of sort of the major characters? Do you think they're, well fleshed out? Do you find them more, one-dimensional? What do you think of let's take them to 4 or 5 main ones.
I absolutely think that Fitzgerald, and in the movie, that every single character was fully fleshed out and a perfect example of using not just main characters, but also secondary characters in both the movie and in the book. I did remember the other movie that I was thinking about earlier, and I don't know if you'd have ever seen, just went out of my head again. The movie about Zelda. Z. Have you ever seen Z?
Oh, I didn't even know there was a movie about Zelda.
Yeah. It's really, really good. And the reason why I bring that up is because it was a novel about their life, about Zelda Fitzgerald and her meeting him and everything, and that time period. And it really showed the kind of lifestyle that they lived. It was, very it was all about those same themes about wealth and parties and the 1920s and everything, and plus him trying to be a writer, and it just I think all of those elements, like I said before, really were portrayed in this. And it's curious to me how did Fitzgerald and did Baz Luhrmann use some of those elements of who they were as people, into incorporating them into making these characters feel really real. I think that's a really it's a feat, and I think it was well done, very well done. More so in the second movie. I felt very flat about, especially Daisy Buchanan in the first one. I'm not a huge fan of Mia Farrow, but I didn't think that she really embodied Daisy to the fullest sense. But the actress that played her in the second movie, that was exactly, to me, she reminded me in some ways, not in every way, about how Zelda might have been.
Do you think the films, properly represent Nick Carraway as an unreliable narrator? So I think that's one of the novel's defining features. Especially there's an early chapter that ends with him saying something to the effect of, I am the only trustworthy person I've ever known, or something like that, which I feel like is Fitzgerald just kind of flashing a sign saying hey, do not trust everything he's saying, because a normal person would not talk that way.
Yeah, and we kind of talked about that last week about the unreliable narrator, and he's definitely unreliable, because I think he has just as much of an infatuation about Gatsby as probably even more so than anybody. And yet it was an interest in how Gatsby even used him, to get to what he what he wanted. It wasn't truly about a friendship. He, just like he used everybody in his life to get where he wanted and get what he wanted, he used Nick as well. But yet Nick is probably the most honest, person in the whole entire movie and and book.
Well, that's part of what I'm saying. Though, is I mean, since Nick is the narrator, to what I guess also becomes like to what extent is he sort of distorting what happened to make himself look like the good guy? So I think especially in the older version,
Yeah.
since I thought it was sort of lacking some of that unreliable narrator aesthetic, that Nick ends up coming off as sort of a very general or sort of like a very like kind of bland, nice guy.
Yeah.
With
Yeah.
not much else characterization. I think
Yeah.
the more recent version, tries a little harder with that. Although I just also want to say that since in this newer version that since Nick is portrayed by Tobey Maguire, and that I think everyone from my generation grew up with Tobey Maguire as Spider-Man, that's always kind of fun to watch him in sort of that role, kind of playing opposite Leonardo DiCaprio as Gatsby.
Yeah, yeah. That's funny that you said that because I was thinking about watching that movie Glory, and I was like, I can't watch this. I'm sure it's probably an incredible movie, but I cannot watch Matthew Broderick in anything except Ferris Bueller's Day Off. So
So
it's
we're
like
never going to get to Glory on our podcast.
Well, maybe, but I'm just gonna have to like get over the fact that when I see him, all I can see is that was such an iconic movie in my generation for the 80s. But anyway, I understand what you're saying though, because it's hard to see, because you like fixate on them as a particular character.
It's like the entire time it's watching it, it's just like, oh look, it's Spider-Man.
Yeah, and isn't it incredible? You think about Leonardo DiCaprio as Gatsby. I think whenever I first heard that he was going to play Gatsby, it was kind of curious to me. Maybe because I was thinking too much of the first one and who might fit more into that character. Because I think about like whenever Brad Pitt played in Meet Joe Black, there was that scene that was very, very reminiscent of The Great Gatsby whenever he's walking out from the big, huge mansion and, he's looking down over the field and the party that's going on. And I remember, because that came out way before The Great Gatsby, the second one. And I remember thinking whenever I saw that, wow, they should, make The Great Gatsby again and have him in it. Because, of course, people say how much he looks like Robert Redford. And so I was kind of thinking how much he might fit into that character. So when I heard that it was Leonardo DiCaprio, I was kind of like, I don't know, it was kind of a curious, but hey, he did it. He did it perfectly. I think he can do anything. He can pretty much act anything. And I don't really like associate him with any particular character because he's so different in each of the films that I've seen him in. And I think he did. I think he played Jay Gatsby like perfectly.
I mean, I think a testament to the fact of how his sort of portrayal as Gatsby has been received is the fact that the image of him sort of lifting the glass, I guess it's of champagne.
Oh yeah.
The scene where he's introduced is one of the most famous like GIFs on social media.
It is. It
that whenever any
is.
type of like good for you or
I've used
or
it.
anything like that, it's like it's always being used. You can see it almost every day.
Oh yeah, I've used it myself, so I know exactly the one you're talking about. So, which is curious because like one of my favorite movies of Leonardo DiCaprio's is What's Eating Gilbert Grape, and I think that was his first one, his first film, if I'm not mistaken, and he should have won an Academy Award for that one, to being so young. And I don't, even today, whenever I watch that movie, I'm still like, how did he? It was obvious that he was going to be his career was going to be phenomenal and I think he's just like been able to do that again and again with all of his movies. This is no exception. The Great Gatsby is no exception. It's like very, very well done. And I have to say, so like kind of going back to our like talking about lines and stuff, I'm just gonna bring this up. My other favorite line is about I'm going to read it. It says, "But above the gray land and the spasms of oblique dust which drift endlessly over it, you perceive, after a moment, the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eichelberg. The eyes of Dr. T.J. Eichelberg are blue and gigantic. Their retinas are 1 yard high. They look out of no face, but instead from a pair of enormous yellow spectacles which pass over a non-existent nose." I just, whenever he describes that about those eyes looking out, and some of like the reviews and you know, talking about that imagery, about the judgmental look from that billboard looking over everything that was happening, and how Nick felt about it, and how he was the only one who noticed it. You know, everybody else was going about their lives and doing whatever they were going to do under those eyes, but Nick is the one who noticed it. And I thought that was just another incredible way of portraying such incredible symbology in the book and in the movie. That was portrayed to perfection as well. And Fitzgerald, wow, how he was able to take that. You always want that, don't you? Like in your book, whenever you're writing, you want that, like that iconic scene to come, for a reader for it to really stand out.
Right, I was going to say that I think, especially in more recent years, there's been sort of like almost like a warning to writers about sort of an aggressive use of, metaphors and similes and things like that. And I'm not sure almost any prose writer is as effective, their use of metaphors to build imagery than as Fitzgerald was.
Yeah, I agree. I absolutely agree. Is there anybody that you can think of, though, nowadays? I wonder.
I mean, I'm current in the process, since Cormac McCarthy passed away about a week ago,
Yeah.
I'm in the process of rereading The Road.
Oh,
He uses them not quite as, as frequently as Fitzgerald does, but he probably is, a better user of them than I think most other modern writers.
yeah. And so you think about Baz Luhrmann using those different symbols throughout the movie.
Yeah.
I even think about like the image of them driving across the bridge, and the image of the airplane, in the sky. There was so much symbolism in just that airplane. He didn't have to have that in the movie, but that just kind of represented where everything is going up and then everything can come down. It just, and that feeling of soaring, I think Nick was feeling that as they were driving across the bridge, and he was looking at the other car, and they were partying in the other car, and he was feeling that soaring feeling. But how then, it even brought it down, how that they were just on the verge. They were on the verge of the Great Depression, and yet none of them knew it at that moment. I just think that was a perfect symbology for even in the movie.
Yeah. One thing that I would like to mention is just kind of going back to like the novel's history and Fitzgerald's background,
Yeah.
given sort of my personal interest in Eisenhower, is
Yeah.
sort of the kind of mostly unknown relationship between Fitzgerald and Eisenhower.
Oh.
Which is that, so people who might know a little bit about Fitzgerald's background might know that that before World War I, he had fallen in love with sort of a wealthy heiress whose parents kind of pushed him away, saying like, he's not of our social class, so he's not a good fit, which obviously he would draw inspiration from for Gatsby's character arc. But that he was so devastated by that when World War I broke out and the United States entered it in 1917, that he decided he wanted to essentially commit suicide by fighting on the Western Front. And so he joined the army and was training under Eisenhower, who was a captain at the time. And they did not get on at all.
Oh, wow.
That Fitzgerald was essentially interested only in writing, and Eisenhower was like, why is this soldier so lazy? So I think there was a mutual sort of contempt there. But then what's interesting is that, so as a lot of people know, so The Great Gatsby was not a big hit when it first came out. and Fitzgerald considered himself to be a failure when he passed away in 1940.
Yeah.
But then during World War II, Eisenhower's headquarters, which was called SHAEF, wanted to pick a handful of novels to distribute to the soldiers, basically as an easy form of entertainment during the buildup for D-Day in 1944. And by coincidence, The Great Gatsby is one of the novels that was chosen for that.
Wow.
And that sort of just high level of visibility for the novel among hundreds of thousands of soldiers was one of the key factors that propelled it into global fame.
That's I never knew that. Thank you for sharing that. That's a really interesting tidbit.
Yeah, so I just think it's kind of, an interesting little relationship between Fitzgerald and Eisenhower.
Yeah.
I was actually thinking of building a chapter of the Eisenhower Chronicles out of that, but I think at a certain point the novel just reached a certain length, and I was like, I probably shouldn't.
Yeah, that happens, doesn't it? Oh, that's really interesting. Well, I think this has been a great review. So you want to give the movie, let's give the first one some stars first. What would you give the first one?
For the first film, I would probably give 7 out of 10.
Yeah, I agree. I think I might, maybe a little generous. I might give it a 6 though. A 6 out of 10. And then the second one?
All right, I know we're going to divide here, but I'm pretty much going to give the second one also a 7 out of 10.
Really? Okay. Yes, we're going to have to divide because it's definitely a 10 in my book. It's like one of my favorite. I could watch that again and again.
Okay.
All right. So
I'm glad that you enjoyed it.
Yeah, definitely. And next week,
I should say the novel I would obviously give a 10 to.
Oh yeah, definitely. The novel is a 10.
No question there. Yeah.
Yeah, everybody should definitely read the novel. Don't judge the book by the movies, either one of them. The book is definitely a 10 out of 10. So that's a must read for anybody. So, but I know next week's movie we're going to be reviewing is Lawrence of Arabia. And I already know that's going to be a 10 out of 10 for you.
It's pretty much the definition of a 10.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so everybody, like I said, next week we're going to be reviewing Lawrence of Arabia. So maybe you could people who listen to this podcast episode, we want you to go out and watch the movie ahead of time so that when we post our review next week, that we want to get all of your comments about how you felt about it. Add your comments about your reviews, your thoughts. We'd love to hear more. And we thank you so much for everybody who's listening. I'm Dee Marley, and along with my co-host,
Michael Zucker.
And we really appreciate you listening to the podcast today. This is Dee and Michael from the History Bards podcast. Have a great day. Keep making history and keep listening.
Thank you for listening to the History Bards Historical Movie Reviews. Don't forget to click the subscribe button and follow us at our YouTube channel at the Historical Fiction Company or on Spotify.